In ancient times, like the whisper of the wind, tales were told of the kingdom of Alfheim, ruled by the Viking king Sigurd, a warrior with a firm hand and an unbreakable will. His hair and beard, black as the starless night itself, became a symbol of power and mystery among his subjects. People believed that Sigurd embodied the essence of the ancient Norse gods, protecting them from both human and supernatural threats. But as is often the case, greatness attracts envious eyes. One such gaze belonged to Albert, a cunning Anglo-Saxon king who saw in Alfheim not merely lands to conquer, but a throne promising him immortality in the annals of history. Albert differed from ordinary warriors. While Vikings relied on the courage of the blade and the might of the shield, Albert staked his claim on endurance, intrigue, and poisoned diplomacy. He realized that a direct confrontation with a ruler like Sigurd would be tantamount to suicide. So he began to gradually undermine the kingdom, seducing allies and sowing discord among clan chieftains. Every promise of gold or protection from Albert echoed like a treacherous whisper in Alfheim's wooden halls, further isolating Sigurd. The threat was not a blade aimed at the chest, but a slowly advancing shadow that seemed to grow with each new dawn. Sigurd, known not only for his strength but also for his cunning, felt the ring tightening around him. He understood that the loyalty of his people was his greatest weapon, but preserving it in the face of tempting promises and venomous whispers was no easy task. He convened a council and addressed the chieftains in a voice like thunder, urging them to remember their oath given to the gods and the throne of Alfheim. Yet, deep down, he knew the real challenge was a personal encounter with Albert, a man whose power stemmed more from his mind than from steel. The fate of the kingdom hung by a thread, awaiting its moment. Before becoming the king, now threatened by betrayal, Sigurd was known as Thunder Axe, a name that made enemies tremble. From a young age, he demonstrated exceptional combat skills, displaying not only physical prowess, but also strategic thinking. Legends say that in one of his first campaigns, he led an attack on a Saxon fleet amidst a raging storm. As ships tossed and turned, Sigurd used the waves to his advantage, maneuvering his fleet with almost supernatural precision. The victory was so overwhelming that the Saxons dubbed him Fury of the North. Each of Sigurd's victories spawned stories that transformed into legends. Recall the Battle of Alesko, where he and his warriors faced an army 5 times their size. Instead of retreating, he ordered his warriors to feign flight, luring the enemy into a narrow gorge. There, Sigurd surrounded and crushed them with such ferocity and efficiency that he earned the respect and fear of both allies and foes. For the people of Alfheim, these victories were not just achievements, but signs of divine protection, proof that Sigurd's destiny was intertwined with greatness. Yet his talents extended beyond the battlefield. Sigurd understood that true conquest went beyond mere force. He knew how to govern conquered lands, offering strategic alliances and respecting the traditions of vanquished peoples. In this way, he united cultures and expanded Alfheim to unprecedented sizes. Nevertheless, his legacy was also marked by scars. With each victory, Sigurd made enemies who patiently awaited his weakness. And now, this glorious past seemed to be both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. Unlike Sigurd, a man of steel and storm, Albert positioned himself as God's chosen, a monarch whose authority stemmed from both crown and altar. Raised in a kingdom where the power of the church was closely intertwined with that of the throne, Albert quickly understood that faith and politics were equally potent weapons. He was not known for his physical strength or bravery on the battlefield, but for his mastery of words, which sounded simultaneously like prayer and decree. His kingdom prospered not through direct conquests, but through the psychological dominance he skillfully employed, maintaining the loyalty of his subjects and keeping allies perpetually indebted. Albert considered himself the hand of God on earth, a leader whose purpose was to expand the reach of his faith and his rule. He built magnificent temples, symbols of his alliance with the clergy, and raised armies that carried both the cross and the sword. Under his rule, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom became a formidable force, combining religious fervor with military strategy. But his true genius lay in diplomacy. Albert knew when to offer sweet words and when to wield the threat of excommunication, a power no leader dared to ignore. For him, conquest was not merely about seizing territory, but about subjugating souls, and Sigurd, with his Norse gods, represented a challenge to the divine order he sought to establish. Despite his image as a pious monarch, Albert possessed a cold, strategic mind. He understood perfectly that battles fought in the name of faith were no less brutal than those decided by the clash of steel. Skillfully using the church as both shield and sword, he dispatched emissaries to spread disinformation and undermine the morale of his opponents, promising forgiveness and protection to those who would join his banners. His talent for transforming military conflicts into ideological struggles was truly unparalleled. Nevertheless, behind the mask of virtue lurked a ruler who understood that unlimited power demanded sacrifices, even from those who unreservedly believed in his divine mission. And so, uttering the name of the Lord, Albert prepared to challenge Sigurd, firmly resolved to prove that divine light would always triumph over the darkness of ancient gods. The kingdom of Alfheim, ruled by Sigurd, represented extremes in everything, from its geographical location to the customs of its inhabitants. Spread between impassable fjords and impenetrable forests, this state seemed to reflect the character of the king himself. Majestic, wild, and full of mysteries. The capital, Skad, rose on a rocky cliff above the sea, its wooden and stone towers steadfastly enduring the onslaught of icy winds that seemed to howl battle hymns. At the heart of the city lay Sigurd's magnificent hall, not just an architectural structure, but the living heart of Alfheim, where warriors, skalds, and advisors gathered to share lore, forge alliances, and determine the kingdom's future. Sigurd's reign was marked by a unique blend of strength and wisdom. He governed with a firm hand, yet with deep respect for traditions and the opinions of clan chiefs. His people mirrored his own essence, unyielding, loyal, and fiercely loving freedom. Under his leadership, Alfheim prospered not only materially, but also in the development of its culture and identity. Festivals honoring the ancient gods were regularly held, strength competitions organized, and heroic sagas performed to the sound of lyres. Trade flourished, with merchants bringing spices, precious metals, and exotic artifacts from distant lands. Sigurd believed that a strong state must honor the past while looking to the future. However, Alfheim's true strength lay in its warriors. Trained from an early age in weaponry and navigating treacherous seas, Sigurd's Vikings inspired fear and respect. They trained under the rumble of thunder and fought as if every battle were a sacred ritual. Sigurd believed that honor in combat was the foundation of life, and he encouraged his people to strive for glory not only through strength, but also through tactical thinking and courage. But just as the mountains surrounding the kingdom concealed dark gorges, so too did Sigurd's rule harbor hidden threats. Even during periods of apparent calm, he understood that the situation could change at any moment, bringing trials that even the might of Alfheim could not overcome. Sigurd's and Albert's paths first crossed almost imperceptibly, but this encounter was like the collision of two powerful hurricanes. During a campaign south, Sigurd decided to personally inspect his kingdom's borders to assess the situation in neighboring lands. Accompanied by only a few loyal warriors, in a valley shrouded in light mist, he spotted a foreign detachment, well-groomed horses, banners with Christian symbols, and a small contingent of Anglo-Saxon guards. Initially, there were no signs of hostility. Both sides halted at a safe distance, observing each other with an understanding that spoke more than words. Albert was there, recognizable by his proud bearing and cloak adorned with golden crosses. He did not communicate directly with Sigurd, but the gaze they exchanged was enough to seal something more profound than any treaty. The Anglo-Saxon king stood unyielding, his eyes studying the Viking as if assessing a piece on a chessboard. Sigurd, in turn, held his gaze, bearing the weight of a man who had already faced forces beyond human comprehension. Although no words were exchanged between them, there was an unspoken agreement. Both understood that this meeting would not be their last, and that subsequent encounters would involve far more than a silent exchange of glances. Before the delegations parted, Albert ordered one of his envoys to deliver a parchment to Sigurd. The Viking suspiciously unrolled it later in his tent and found words written in elegant script. True strength lies not in the axe, but in the will that wields it. We are destined to meet again, and on that day, we will know whose will is stronger. Upon reading this, Sigurd merely smiled faintly, but the gleam in his eyes indicated that the challenge had been accepted. A meeting between the two monarchs was as inevitable as the clash of two mighty tidal waves. Albert, possessing a keen mind, understood that invasion was not just about brute force, but also about identifying the enemy's weaknesses. Therefore, he dispatched secret spies into Sigurd's kingdom, tasking them with assessing not only its defenses, but also the very essence of what made Alfheim unique. For several weeks, Albert's men infiltrated the forests and villages, observing the people of Alfheim with the keen eyes of predators stalking prey before an attack. What they discovered was both captivating and unsettling for the Anglo-Saxon king. Sigurd had forged a state where honor, strength, and ancient gods held sway over people's hearts. Every village seemed imbued with primal energy, with pagan festivals dedicated to the forces of nature and myths of ancient warriors. The forges were always lit, the sound of hammers echoing like a unifying chant for all Vikings, and festivals were filled with vigils and sacred rituals. For Albert, confronting Sigurd's culture was not merely a clash of different customs, but felt like a direct threat to his conviction in the sole true path to spiritual salvation. Sigurd's lands appeared to him as a fragment of the past, where the light of Christian faith had not yet shone, and this absence of belief in a single God he perceived as a sacred mission to be fulfilled. Albert saw Alfheim not just as territory to conquer, but as a land in need of conversion, of being brought into the light of true faith. The ancient gods, with their rituals of sacrifice and feasting, were an affront to the world order based on divine grace. Observing the undeniable authority Sigurd held over his people, Albert realized that victory over the Viking had to be not only military, but also spiritual. His goal was not so much to seize lands and wealth as to conquer the souls of the Vikings. He saw his true mission as bringing salvation to these people who, in his opinion, were lost in the shadows of ancient myths. Alfheim needed enlightenment, and he was ready to be the beacon that would lead the pagans to the true light of Christ. Being a calculating man, Albert understood that an open confrontation with Sigurd would be too risky an undertaking. The Viking was an experienced warrior, and his army, though small, was fierce and invincible on its home ground. Therefore, instead of a direct assault, he chose a more sophisticated tactic, a strike from the shadows under the cloak of betrayal. To execute his plan, he needed a man from Sigurd's inner circle, hungry for power and susceptible to promises of reward. This man turned out to be Rurik, Sigurd's trusted warlord, whose loyalty had always been questionable, fueled by envy and ambition. Albert, using his gift of persuasion, reached out to Rurik through intermediaries, convincing him that the only path to greatness lay through betraying his king. In exchange for treason, Albert promised him untold riches, lands, and an honorable place in his empire. Rurik, whose ambition outweighed loyalty, saw in this offer a chance not to be missed. For several weeks, he conducted secret negotiations with Albert's envoys, devising a plan that would decide Sigurd's fate. The deal was struck, and Rurik became the key to the downfall of a kingdom that, until recently, had seemed impregnable. While Rurik occupied key positions in Sigurd's castle, Albert began his attack, acting strategically and covertly. As Sigurd prepared for a military campaign in another region of his kingdom, Rurik ensured that Alfheim's defenses were weakened. He sabotaged supply lines, undermined alliances with other clans, and spread rumors among Sigurd's warriors, sowing doubt and distrust. When Albert's army finally crossed the borders, Sigurd found himself isolated and vulnerable, unaware that his trust in one of his own men had sealed his fate. The fall of Alfheim, which had seemed impossible, became closer than ever. Sigurd, confident in his strength and experience, embarked on a military expedition to the northern lands, taking 50 of Alfheim's best warriors with him. The goal was clear: to expand his kingdom's domains, open new lands, and find resources for his people's prosperity. But while he and his warriors navigated stormy seas, battled the elements, and confronted enemies in uncharted territories, Alfheim's fate was being sealed quietly and treacherously. With each passing day, the kingdom slipped further from his control and into Albert's grasp. During these 3 weeks of Sigurd's absence, Rurik, now Albert's ally, gradually consolidated his position, seizing towns and forging alliances with local rulers who had previously sworn fealty to Sigurd. The kingdom was being conquered from within, and the inhabitants were torn between fear of the new ruler and the realization of the betrayal spreading through the streets. Albert's troops, thanks to Rurik's strategy, advanced, suppressing all resistance. Old Viking traditions were replaced by new laws concerning the church and the power of God, and temples dedicated to ancient gods were destroyed, giving way to chapels and crosses. Sigurd, far from home, suspected nothing of what was happening in his kingdom. With each victory won in the northern lands, he felt he was closer to securing Alfheim's future. But the truth was that his kingdom's future was already being rewritten without his knowledge. With no communication from his homeland and unaware of the impending betrayal, Sigurd continued to fight, confident in the safety of his people and that Alfheim was under his control. But time passed, and when he returned, a very different homeland would await him, and he would realize that his absence had been the biggest mistake of his life. As Sigurd and his warriors prepared for their journey home, a lone figure, exhausted and covered in road dust, approached their camp. It was Ivo, a young warrior who had served Sigurd for many years, one of those who saw him as a leader and mentor. Ivo, with eyes full of despair and determination, had escaped from the clutches of Albert's and Rurik's men. He had traveled a long way, overcoming unimaginable dangers, to deliver an important message to his king. News of the tragic event struck Sigurd like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. Ivo, gasping from exhaustion and agitation, collapsed before him on his knees and proclaimed in a trembling voice, "My king, Alfheim has fallen. Albert, that treacherous traitor, has usurped the throne and proclaimed himself High King. The golden crown, symbol of your power, now adorns his head, while the people groan under the yoke of his tyranny." These words, like poisoned arrows, pierced Sigurd's heart. He was stunned, unable to believe what he heard, and for a moment, an oppressive silence fell over the camp. But pain and astonishment quickly gave way to furious rage boiling within his soul. Sigurd cast a glance at his loyal companions, at those 50 warriors whose devotion remained unwavering, and realized his duty. "Prepare, sons and daughters of Alfheim. Our kingdom shall be reclaimed," Sigurd commanded, and a flame of insatiable vengeance blazed in his eyes. He understood that Albert and his accomplice Rurik might have seized his crown, but they had not yet managed to break his spirit, nor extinguish the spark of freedom in his heart. Sigurd's return would be the hope that enslaved Alfheim so desperately needed. At the same time, Albert, seated in his newly acquired castle, reveled in the glory and power that had showered upon him like golden rain. Sitting on the throne, now adorned with Sigurd's golden crown, he addressed the assembled crowd with an arrogant speech. "I am the High King. The very will of God has consecrated me, and there is no longer a place for the old gods in this realm." The crown, gleaming in the light of burning torches, seemed to symbolize not only his victory, but also a banner of dominion, a symbol that, in Albert's view, portended his divinity and the coming triumph of Christianity over pagan beliefs. But even at this moment, as he rejoiced and reveled in his power, the distant sound of sharpening steel and iron could be heard. Sigurd, the true king, was coming to reclaim what was rightfully his. Under the cover of night, Sigurd and his detachment approached the borders of Alfheim, moving like shadows through the dense forests. He understood that any carelessness could cost them their much-needed advantage. The kingdom, now under Albert's rule, had undergone significant changes. The castle towers, once symbols of Viking might, no longer inspired the same awe. Sigurd watched intently from afar, analyzing every movement of the patrols and every flag fluttering on the high castle walls. Albert's presence still loomed over Alfheim like an ominous shadow, but Sigurd knew that a direct confrontation could turn into a deadly trap. He needed to act with extreme caution and foresight. In the following days, Sigurd deployed his best spies to infiltrate the villages and markets of the kingdom. He sought to understand the new system imposed by Albert, identify weaknesses in the castle's defenses, and explore opportunities that might arise in the interaction between the invaders and the native inhabitants of Alfheim. He knew that many of his subjects were disunited, fearing harsh punishments from Albert and his new regime. But Sigurd also believed that the loyalty of Alfheim's former subjects could still be awakened. Therefore, he began to devise plans based not only on force, but also on persuasion. He needed to revive the spirit of his people, to call them to fight for freedom. Meanwhile, Albert, firmly established in the castle and never parting with the golden crown, seemed confident in his absolute victory. He celebrated his conquest with excessive overconfidence, made hasty decisions, and underestimated Sigurd's cunning. Sigurd waited patiently, biding his time for the most opportune moment to strike. He understood that he could not afford reckless actions. He had to play on the enemy's overconfidence, and so he devised a sophisticated strategy, a psychological siege. Sigurd had to convince Albert that the kingdom was safer than ever, while in the shadows he prepared his crushing revenge. Sigurd felt that the time to act was inexorably approaching. He had gained the trust of several experienced warriors of the kingdom, men and women who still believed in Alfheim's freedom and the return of the true king. The news of the coming lunar eclipse was taken by him as a sign from above, a rare opportunity that could not be missed. The darkness that was to envelop the night would be an ideal ally in his daring plan. In deep secrecy, he gathered his comrades and shared his strategy. Every step was meticulously planned and precise. Nothing could go wrong. As the night of the eclipse drew near, Sigurd and his warriors prepared for the coming battle. The plan was simple but effective. Instead of attacking the castle head-on, they would infiltrate through the less fortified walls, those that Albert considered safe and that were not guarded as carefully. Using the eclipse to conceal their movements, they would act quickly and silently like ghosts gliding through the shadows. Sigurd believed in his ability to conceal his true intentions and, more importantly, in the patience his warriors had honed over years. They would not merely be invaders, they would be the embodiment of vengeance. The plan was fully ready when the eclipse began. The sky gradually darkened, and the moonlight was swallowed by darkness, creating a night deeper and more ominous than ever before. Sigurd and his warriors lay hidden in the shadows of trees and bushes, gripping their swords and axes, ready for a deadly confrontation. They waited for the signal. The tension was palpable, but no one moved until the appointed hour. The entrance to the castle was already visible, but before approaching it, Sigurd stopped and looked at the dark sky. He understood that this could be the point of no return. Victory or death were about to intertwine in a deadly dance. Sigurd took a deep breath and, with a silent gesture, gave the order to begin the assault. The attack began like a muffled whisper, dissolving into the night's gloom. Sigurd and his brave warriors, like shadows, crept in absolute silence, skillfully using the darkness of the lunar eclipse as their ally. Every step was precisely measured, their breath under strict control. The castle guards, confident in the impregnability of the night and not expecting Sigurd's return, could barely notice the approaching invaders. Sigurd, with his sword drawn and his gaze fixed on the central tower, unerringly chose the fortress's most vulnerable spot, Rurik's chamber. The general, who had once betrayed his king and sworn feigned loyalty to Albert, was now to face the inevitable vengeance of the man he had personally helped to overthrow. Rurik, immersed in thoughts of his supposed victory and consumed by arrogance, had no idea that mere steps from his dungeon, retribution awaited him. Sigurd burst into the chamber like a nocturnal phantom, his movements swift and silent. In an instant, Sigurd's warriors seized Rurik, suppressing any resistance he might offer. The general, with his eyes gleaming with malice and his arrogant speeches, tried to fight back, but his position was hopeless. Sigurd, with a merciless gaze, approached him and, with one precise strike, ended his life. Rurik fell, and the act of betrayal was atoned for by harsh Viking justice. After avenging Rurik, Sigurd and his warriors wasted no time. They moved deeper into the castle, each step growing surer, for victory was now close. Reaching the great gates of Alfheim, Sigurd paused, surveying the silent castle as if already anticipating the inevitable. He looked at his men, standing shoulder to shoulder, ready for anything. Taking a deep breath, Sigurd gestured for the gates to be opened. He stood before his home, ready to reclaim what was rightfully his, but understood that the hardest trials still lay ahead. Sigurd's invasion was ruthless. His warriors and allies, acting as a single mechanism, stormed the castle, sweeping everything in their path. The doors, of which Albert had been so proud, splintered as if the castle itself foresaw the fall of its new master. Sigurd and his men, like shadows, swept through the corridors, eliminating guards with surgical precision and swiftly seizing rooms. The walls that had witnessed Albert's arrogance now became silent spectators to the true king's return. Each battle inside the castle seemed like a distant echo of Sigurd's past victories, reminding everyone that he was not just a warrior, but the rightful heir to the throne. In the very heart of the castle, Sigurd faced his main opponent, Albert's Grandmaster, a giant of steel with vast experience, the Anglo-Saxon king's right-hand man, ready to defend the remnants of the kingdom. The Grandmaster wielded his sword skillfully, posing a serious threat, but Sigurd was no longer the youth who recklessly charged into battle. Now he was a warrior with the heart of a strategist. The battle was fierce, the clang of swords echoing throughout the castle. Each of Sigurd's strikes was precise and accurate, and finally, with an unexpected move, he disarmed the Grandmaster, stripping him of his defense. The Grandmaster fell to his knees, and Sigurd, with a cold gaze, delivered the final blow, destroying the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance. With the Grandmaster's death, the castle fully came under Sigurd's control. Albert, the king who considered himself all-powerful, found himself isolated, and his reign came to an end. Sigurd headed to the great throne room where Albert awaited him, his golden crown still gleaming, but his gaze filled with despair. The Anglo-Saxon king understood that he had been defeated, and the divine power he so believed in could not save him. Sigurd, with his imposing presence, looked at Albert, who tried to resist to the last, but words and agreements were useless now. With a sharp motion, Sigurd took the golden crown from Albert's head and placed it on his own. Silence fell over the hall, and the last traces of Anglo-Saxon rule vanished in that moment. Sigurd ascended the throne, the golden crown now adorning his head. He surveyed the hall, where the history of his lineage, his land, and his battles for justice were carved in stone and shadow. The kingdom he had reclaimed lay in ruins, but with the strength of his leadership, he knew that Alfheim would rise from the ashes. His warriors rallied around him, and the kingdom, freed from Albert's tyranny, would once again be governed by courage, honor, and wisdom. Sigurd looked to the future with a steady gaze and a resolute heart. The throne now belonged to him by right, but the real battle for Alfheim's prosperity was just beginning.